G'day everyone. Thank you for those who are watching on YouTube. Sorry we didn't get to record it on Wednesday night, but hopefully we'll get it today as we look at Revelation again. Interrupted some conversations here, so sorry about we are starting a bit late. I need to put this on and hopefully be able to hear it a bit better on there as well. Let me just turn this on. One, two, it will start. One, there we go. So, welcome to those on YouTube. If you watch this reply or recording, which would be good. It's a little loud, isn't it? Okay, excuse me a minute. I'm going to turn it down. One, two. That's a bit bad. Maybe even that one. All right. Yes, he introduced everyone else to hang on, sorry. All right, so we're in Revelation 17 and 18 today, and I might just pray before we jump in. Lord, we want to thank you for your word again. Thank you for this book. It takes a fair bit of grappling, but it has wonderful things to say. And we pray, Lord, that you would open our eyes and our hearts, our minds and our wills to what you're saying to us. That this isn't just some academic exercise, but the exercise to help us love Jesus more and follow after you more in the Lord. And we ask that in your name. Amen. All right. It has been interesting to prepare this one because as I've been brooding over it, I can see how some conclusions that I've been forming have been somewhat challenged. I know I've been saying that we submit to the text, and now it's challenging me to submit to the text. So I'll be able to share some of that. Some of my views have changed as I've looked at these chapters today. So let me just read chapter 17 to us. It'll be on the screen or in a Bible if you have it, and then we can go from there. One of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits by many waters. With her the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries." Then the angel carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet and was glittering with gold, precious stones and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand filled with abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. The name written on her forehead was a mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. I saw the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people and the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus. When I saw her, I was greatly astonished. Then the angel said to me, "Why are you astonished? I will explain to you the mystery of the woman and of the beast she rides, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast which you saw once was, now is not, yet will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. The inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world, will be astonished when they see the beast, because it once was, now is not, and yet will come. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are the 7 hills on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, one is, the other has not yet come. But when he does come, he must remain for only a little while. The beast who once was and now is not is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. The 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but who for an hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. They have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. They will wage war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will triumph over them because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and with him will be his called, chosen and faithful followers. Then the angel said to me, "The waters you saw, where the prostitute sits, are peoples, multitudes, nations and languages. The beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the prostitute. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God has put into their hearts to accomplish his purpose by agreeing to hand over to the beast their royal authority until God's words are fulfilled. The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth." Now, chapter 17 introduces us to this great prostitute or great harlot. I must only use the word harlot as we go through today, called Babylon the Great. But who is this harlot? That's one of the key questions people ask. And more to the point, why are these chapters here? Where do they fit in the flow of what's been going on in the book? It's a very interesting question because as I've been reading over this last week or so, not a lot of commentaries talk about where this fits into the flow of Revelation. We found ourselves at Armageddon at the end of chapter 16, the end of all things when Christ returns and all evil is destroyed. So it does seem fairly clear we're going back here. We're going back before it because evil's present again. In chapter 16, we read the angel say, "It is done." Well, clearly it's not quite done yet. So there is some sense of going back to something before chapter 16 or in the midst of chapter 16. But why recapitulate? Why repeat things here? Are we going over new ground? Is there something new that we're being introduced to? And the answer to those questions does come down to how you understand the harlot and who she represents. At the very least, there is certainly a sense that there is something else that is standing against God that is idolatrous and evil, like a fourth player we're being introduced to here. We've had the devil with the red dragon. We've had the beast of the sea or the Antichrist. We've had the beast of the land or the false prophet. Well, now we've got this harlot, this sort of new figure linked to references to a great Babylon that we came across in chapter 16 already, just briefly. Whatever the actual referent of who the harlot or the Babylon refers to, what I mean by referent, I mean the historical object or the historical person or the historical thing that she represents. It's clear that it's idolatrous and evil. Perhaps what we have here is the vision coming to John to show us the impact of the beast and the harlot on humankind and its structures in the running up to the return of Jesus and Armageddon. That might be what these two chapters are trying to tell us, because they clearly work together. In chapter 17, the harlot's introduced and the beast, although we've read things about the beast already in chapter 13, and we'll go over that in a minute. And in chapter 18, the inhabitants of the earth, the kings of the earth, have a lament over the fall of Babylon. They cry out and say, it's so sad, but we'll find out what sort of lament it is. So they respond to the judgment upon Babylon. You see in verse 1 how an angel introduces the harlot to John in the vision. Says it's sitting by many waters. Now later in verse 15, the angel says the waters represents peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. The inhabitants of the earth is clearly what's being referred to here, which we know are those without the mark of the land, those who stand against God. Verse 2 makes it plain what she's been doing. It's up there highlighted. She's been fornicating with the kings of the earth and the inhabitants of the earth. They are intoxicated with the wine of her adultery. We've got all these images of sexual practices that are outside God's way here, adultery, fornication, all that sort of stuff. Well, we know, although sexual practice may be in mind, and we've only got to look at the history of Rome in the first century and its paganism, had a whole lot of religious prostitutes and all that sort of stuff was linked together. But it's mostly more here about religious idolatry than sexual adultery, if you want to say that. Because we know in the Old Testament that when Israel had its back towards Yahweh, in passages like Ezekiel 16 and 17, and even the book of Hosea, God describes Israel like a prostitute. Remember in Hosea, he tells Hosea to marry a prostitute as an image of his relationship with his people. So there's a strong link between the sexual images we've got here and the religious idolatry as a concept. So this harlot's been busy. She's drawing the kings of the earth and the inhabitants of the earth. Remember, these phrases refer to people who don't have the mark of the land, that are rebelling against God, and drawing them away from God and deceiving them or bringing idolatry to them. So their eyes will be off God as their creator and onto something else. That seems to be what we see here. And then the angel talks about the harlot in particular, verses 3 to 6. John is carried by the Spirit into the wilderness and sees a woman sitting on a scarlet beast. We've got images of chapter 12 here because, of course, he went to the wilderness there and saw a woman. Now, it's a different woman. That was the woman who gave birth to the Messiah, which I said was the messianic community in the image that was there. Here it certainly isn't that, but it's still a woman with a religious edge to it. Some people suggest, some commentators, that a woman often refers to the church in the Bible. You can see that, whether that's the point here, because it clearly is not the church, but it might be something that is religious, something like the church, you could say. And we'll outline that as we go a bit further into the chapter. This woman in chapter 17, which we know to be the great harlot, because we read that later, is dressed in purple and scarlet, glittering with gold and precious stones and pearls. Now, these colours and these gems take our minds back to Exodus and Leviticus, where it describes the priestly garments that the priest would wear that had gems all over it, and the colours of scarlet of not just royalty, but also priestly work as well. We can see that's part of it. The reference to a golden cup in her hand, filled with abominable things and filth of her adultery, takes us back to chapter 14, verse 8, where it said, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, which made all the nations drink the mannering wine of her adulteries." So there's a repeat of something that he raised before, and now outlining it in more detail. And then John sees the name on her forehead. Mystery. Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and the abominations of the earth. Now remember, mystery in the New Testament is not like a whodunit. You've got to work it out. We talked about this before. We talked about the mystery in chapter 11. In the New Testament, the mystery is an unfolding of something that's been revealed a little bit, and then it's revealed slowly over time, like God's gospel agenda, which was a mystery to the Jews and to the angels. And then when Jesus came, at least those Jews who started following him as the Messiah, it was unfolded. That was Paul's testimony as a Pharisee, for example. So in one sense, we're seeing the unfolding of evil in the Bible here. So, for example, the devil, you don't read much about him in the Old Testament. We see him in Job, of course. We see him in Genesis chapter 3, who, as the serpent tempts Eve and Adam to eat the fruit of the tree they shouldn't eat. There's not a lot of other references in the Old Testament about that. When you get to the New Testament, it increases a little more. Jesus might not talk about the devil directly, though he does mention him in some ways. Certainly we see him at play in tempting Jesus. We see him maybe in Gethsemane. But then when you come to the letters, Paul talks a little bit more about him. We read about him in Ephesians chapter 6 and the spiritual warfare that's at play there. We see in 1 Peter chapter 5 when it says the evil one is like a lion surrounding us to try and devour us. And then you come to Revelation, you see nearly full blown. It has developed over time as we go through. So here in chapter 17, the betrayal of Satan's religious deception, not only of the kings of the earth, but even potentially the church itself, is being played out in much more fullness than earlier on in the Bible. Now, in verse 4, we see the other side of this behaviour, namely the persecution of any who do follow Jesus. This woman is drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the martyrs of Jesus who bore testimony to Jesus. And verse 6 gives the sense of the presence of this harlot who've done this. John says he is greatly astonished when he saw her in this vision. That could be in horror or it could be in awe. Maybe it's not he's allured by her beauty or by her tempting presence, but there is something about her that grabs him. He goes, wow, sort of thing is what we're sort of getting the impression here. He's taken aback, some might say. Now, before we jump to the angel's explanation of the harlot and the beast as well to an extent, let's just jump back to this question of who is the harlot? Who may she represent? These might be seen as two different questions in the one sense, but they're both worth considering because although maybe each question can help us find a way forward with the other. Pardon me. There are about 5 different interpretations over the last 2,000 years of who this harlot could represent, and looking at them can be helpful, not just from a thinking academic perspective, but also help us understand the text and then its application to us today. In my mind, and the mind of many commentators, it's clear that this woman, as I've already indicated, has a religious edge to her. This gives the beginning of the context for identifying not only who it might be referring to, but also not just in that time, but right through history. So on this basis, the commentators at the Protestant Reformation, people like Edwards and John Wesley and Martin Luther, who do you think they said the harlot was? Any guesses? The Roman Catholic Church, not just Rome, but the Roman Catholic Church was the harlot, the religious expression of those who went against. There's people who still say that today. I'll tap into that a bit later on. And they pick up the same things we've spoken about, the Old Testament religious imagery of the colours and the gems, the sexual promiscuity and adultery, or all of it is this religious edge. But there's a problem with this. The interesting thing to note is that the Reformation commentators also identified the beast as the Catholic Church. And you come later in verse 16 that the harlot rides the beast, but then the beast turns on the harlot. So I'm not quite sure how Catholic Church can turn on itself. And we'll go back to verse 16 later. I'll refer a number of times when we get to it. But it's a problem with this view. Secondly, there's also the problem of how this would have relevance to the people of the first century if the harlot was the Roman Catholic Church, particularly of the 16th century, 600 years later. So to say that was her particular historical reference means it didn't really mean anything to the first readers. So that's again this issue of coming to our time too quickly, wanting to rest in the first century and then out of that bring it to our time, which would seem the most commentators suggest the Protestant Reformation commentators didn't do so much when they jumped so quickly to the Pope and Rome as a representation of these images in Revelation. Now, related to this view is a second view that sees it, or in a sense, that these idolatrous religious structures might just be Catholic. They might be any Christian apostasy. Again, that the great harlot is any religious challenge. Mormonism, some might say, for example, that I've read that, but there'll be another example of it. Now, again, there is an issue there perhaps of the system sitting on the beast turning on the religious system, but that's maybe can be seen that way as well. But again, jumping quickly to a Mormonism or a Jehovah's Witness type example first still follows the same problem we have with the Catholic view. They let it sit in the first century first. And therefore you might say, well, maybe it's the pagan Roman religion. That's in the first century. Maybe that's what the harlot's referring to. Yeah, it could be that. The emperor cult was strong, as we know, and it certainly was idolatrous. Took people's eyes off the creator and put that on the emperor in particular. But of course, the same issue arises. Most people say the beast, who hold this Roman-centered view of interpreting Revelation in this first century, would say the beast is the Roman structure. Or maybe, as we'll talk about in a minute, it's a difference between the Roman political structure and the Roman religious structure. So you had the whole structure of Roman society, which the beast might represent. Then you had the Roman religious cult in the harlot. But there's no reference in the history that the Roman political structure turned on the Roman religious culture or religious structure. So when you come to verse 16 again, where they turn on each other, there's nothing in history to show that. So maybe Rome might be the beast. That might be the beginning of that, as we've spoken about, the first example of the Antichrist. But it might well be that the religious structure is not Roman paganism because the Roman political structure never turned on it later. We'll pick up that thought around it, but that might be about, it's not necessarily just about Roman paganism. The second view is maybe it's about all evil systems, not necessarily religious. Sam Storms comments on two commentators who say this, Beale and Hendrickson, when he says, Babylon is a symbol of human civilization with all its pomp and circumstance organised in opposition to God. It is the sum total of pagan culture, social, intellectual, commercial, political and religious. See, it's a broad thing here, he's saying. It's the essence of evil and pagan opposition to Jesus as Lord and Saviour. It's the symbol for collective rebellion against God in any and every form. It's a universal or world system of unbelief, idolatry, apostasy that opposes and persecutes the people of God. Now, you read a bit further, and he takes that broadness and then limits it to the religious stuff when he talks about the harlot, which takes us back to the previous points about the Catholic Church and others. But once again, we have the problem of turning upon itself, but he starts in this place. So I can't see a consistency between the two as he does that, because he would say the beast also represents that evil system. So you've got again the evil system with the religious edge of it, turning on each other. Yes, that can happen, and we'll tap on that later. But there's an inconsistency between Babylon means this. Well, Babylon either is the religious expression or it's both. I don't find him talking about that so much. The third idea is Rome. This is the most popular view, that harlot is talking about Rome, first century Rome. And there's evidence that after the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, Babylon was often used as a metaphor for Rome in other writings. Even Peter, in 1 Peter 5 verse 13, might be using the word Babylon to mean that. Rome's world dominance, its paganism, its persecution of the church, all the traits of the harlot make it a very good example. What does chapter 17 verse 18 say? The great city which has dominion over the kings of the earth. In the first century, what city is that? It's Rome. Further, some suggest in chapter 18 there's a lot of economic focus that we'll get to when we talk about chapter 18. If it's an economic focus, it's linked to the most powerful city, the most economic city of the world. And that would also underline Rome. And then finally, and I even referred to this early in this series, in verse 9, it talks about the image of the city on the 7 hills. And that could be, Rome had 7 hills. That could be it. But I want to hold my assumptions. This is where I would sit until I read some information about other things that I'll refer to in a minute. I've often seen Babylon the Great as first representing Rome. But I always had a trouble with this verse 16, where Rome turns on Rome. Now, Rome does fall apart, we know that, and civil war does happen. But to say it's falling upon its religious expression, because I think that is part of the heart, there's just no evidence of it. So I don't know whether Rome actually is a helpful way to understand the harlot in the consistency of what the text is showing, which is why I'm outlining all this to us. Then there's also another view, the futurist view of those who read Revelations only speaking to, the times before Jesus comes, not about us at all. We'll talk more about that the next couple of weeks as we have already. That this is actually a physically rebuilt Babylon. This is Babylon rebuilt on its ancient site. Some suggest this may be the easiest interpretation, but it's far from a foregone conclusion that Scripture should always be interpreted as from the easiest form, especially when you come to a prophetic and apocalyptic language. You can't just jump to that because it's written differently. In fact, I don't know if you've heard, but a man named Gordon Fee died about 3 days ago. Gordon Fee was a biblical scholar. He wrote the book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. He was a wonderful, I never met him, but I read a lot of his books, got a number of his commentaries. He was actually a Pentecostal charismatic, working in non-Pentecostal environments. In fact, the story was when he went to Wheaton College to teach, and he said hello to some of them. For most of them, it was the first Pentecostal they'd ever met. If not the first Pentecostal with a biblical degree they'd ever met, which is sort of signs of that divide of the church back then. And Fee did a whole lot of work to bring them together, both bring an academic rigour to Pentecostal theology and also to open the eyes of non-Pentecostals to say there's actually a lot of truth here that you tend to get rid of. But Fee was known to say, let the nature of the text drive how you read it. And if you read, and there's a bit of an outline of from we did on at the camp last week of How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. His book on his chapter on Revelation is brilliant to help us understand. You have to read it through the nature of the literature you're reading. As we said, you don't read a newspaper article like you read a novel. If you're going to read Lord of the Rings like you read the Courier Mail, it's horrible to compare those two things in the same sentence, but you know what I'm saying. You actually come to the newspaper with a very different mindset to what you do to a book. And that's what we need to have when we talk to apocalyptic writing in the Bible, as against coming to the Gospels, so, for example, all the histories. So there's some of the things that also impact whether this should be read literally, therefore it's a rebuilt Babylon. But even in the text itself, we see an example. The name was a mystery on its head, and the need for a mind of wisdom it talks about. That shows you don't just take it as it is. There's something more to this. And we've seen this right through Revelation. It says this is figurative. There's these little moments where it just reminds us to just say, don't just jump to the first face value reading. Look behind it, and then you can see how the face value reading impacts that. In fact, if you go to the Old Testament, to Jeremiah 50 to 51, and we'll read some passages of that later, and some chapters in Isaiah that prophesies about the collapse of Babylon. Remember, Isaiah and Jeremiah written while Babylon is a big power, has taken the people of Judah into exile to Babylon. And then they bring a prophecy of Babylon's destruction. And when you read those prophecies, and you'll see it later, it actually talks about it will never be rebuilt. So when anyone argues that this Babylon is a rebuilt Babylon, they've got to sort of argue around these Old Testament passages that certainly give the impression that it would never be rebuilt. So I suggest there's no textual support in a little bit of reading that I've done about the rebuilding of a literal Babylon. That idea is founded upon referring to a distant future time, and as one commentator has said, there's nothing in this text or elsewhere in Revelation that suggests a literal rebuilding of Babylon. It's when we're taking our preconceived ideas over the text, rather than the text to find what our ideas are, which is a nice segue to the last example, because this is where I was challenged. I've been aware of this final understanding of the great harlot and what city it refers to, but I've never given it much thought until I read an article by D. Reagan Ewing. It was his Masters of Theology dissertation. There's a copy. I did have 5 copies. It's about a 40-page document. I printed up 5 of them and everyone took them on Wednesday. If you want it, I can email it to you if you like. Just be prepared. It's an academic 40-page argument. And I'll send it to Pam. It's in 5 different Word documents. He argues that Babylon refers to Jerusalem. And it's a bit countercultural when you first think about it. But reading his article, it makes some sense from the text saying that to me. Jerusalem reflects the religious adornment of the harlot that we touched on before. It also, the gems and the colours reflect the priestly garments in Leviticus and Exodus. And as we noted when we talked about it, if you go back to the letters of the churches in the first 3 chapters of Revelation, it talks about the synagogue of Satan, how the Jews were standing against the Christians. Chapter 2, verse 9 says, I know, Jesus' words, I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. We made the point that Christian faith was seen as part of Judaism very early on. But the more there was a difference that came, the Romans would persecute the Jews because their attitude to Judaism was to live with it. They couldn't crush its religion, whereas other places they'd take over, they would just absorb them into their religion. The Jews wouldn't do that. So they allowed the priests to continue and everything to continue in Jerusalem. The Jews kept practicing their faith, albeit with the Romans alongside them. And you see the example of that when Jesus was alive in the Gospels. You had the Jewish authorities and you had the Roman authorities. And of course, when the Jews wanted to do something for Jesus, they had to go to the Roman authorities. You even had a king of the Jews in Herod. So you had this interesting relationship between Jews and Rome. But of course, you know, from 30 AD, the death of Jesus and the resurrection of his ascension, through until 60 AD, the growing distance between the Jews and the Christians, the distance between the Jews and Christians got bigger. And so you find, for example, when Nero burns Rome in the early 60s, who does he blame? The Christians. So a lot of the persecution of Christians, he didn't touch the Jews. So the Jews did, so the Christians did it. That was because there was this growing distance. And you see this in the letters to the churches in Revelation. And if the Jews wanted to bring persecution to the Christians, which they did, you see that in the Gospels, and you see it even in the letters itself. One of the ways they did it was to distance themselves. No, they're not us. they're someone completely different. And so we see this persecution growing to the point that Nero persecuted them quite openly, and then it continued off and on after that. And to me, this is this idea that Ewing's picking up. That coming out of these verses, the letters of the churches, there's a whole apostasy, if you want to use that word, of Jewish faith. They've rejected their Messiah, they've rejected God's way of doing it, and they remain in rebellion against God and his ways, just like the people of the earth, the inhabitants of the earth. And this harlot produces not only that rebellion, that apostasy, but even that persecution on the church. Now, if we take an early date for the writing of Revelation in about 60 AD, which Ewing actually argues for, you can understand that this is in verse 16, when it says the beast, Rome, will turn on the harlot, Jerusalem. That happens in AD 70, doesn't it? When the Romans have enough and they go and they destroy Jerusalem, they destroy the temple. So there could be a prophetic sense in Revelation, if you take the harlot to be Jerusalem, of saying this is going to come when the beast will turn upon this harlot. So he's not turning upon the followers of the beast is not turning on the followers of Jesus in chapter 17. He does that in chapter 13, but in chapter 17 he turns on this religious idolatrous figure. And turning upon the Jews is a first century example of that very, very clearly. So it might well be that he's talking about the Jews, and I'll talk about the date of authorship in just a minute. But another reason that he argues, and I really can't go into much more detail than this, is when you get to chapter 18, which we will do, which talks about all this economic language. Some say that's not about Jerusalem. It wasn't a very strong economy country. It wasn't even, and a lot of the people who bring the lament in chapter 18 are the mariners, the sailors, the people who use the sea, because of course the Mediterranean Sea was a major way of transporting goods. Well, Jerusalem wasn't on the sea. And so, clearly that's pointing towards Rome, I would suggest. But Ewing quotes an Old Testament scholar named Provan, who suggests, actually, when you read chapter 18, which you will in a minute, there are strong links with Old Testament laments. You know, Revelation 18 is a lament full of Babylon, particularly against Tyre in Ezekiel 26 to 28. And even Babylon itself in Jeremiah, the same sort of words, the same sort of ways of being described in there. His suggestion is it might not actually be about the economy of the day. It might be just him making this link to an idea of a lament. And again, the vision that comes to John is a vision that says these people are lamenting or weeping over the loss of a city, the fall of a city, in the same way you've seen that before in the Old Testament. But I'm not quite sure you need to have an early date to accept that Jerusalem might be the harlot. I mean, what about the date of writing? I mean, Ewing does say these positions could be held simultaneously if one considers the imagery of the harlot to be merely reminiscent of AD 70, predicting after the event, as it were. So if it's written in the 90s, it's looking back. That's what he's saying. You could do that. He doesn't see it that way. And some suggest, as he raises, the problem with that view is that Revelation tends to say what is yet to come. You know, in verse 1, chapter 1, and verse 3, verse 1, verse 3, and verse 19, and verse 1 of chapter 4. So it's also, let me show you what is yet to come. So this prophetic future-looking edge of Revelation might go against that. Well, at the same time, I'd argue, like we're right now in 16 and 17, the chronology of Revelation mightn't necessarily always be the chronology of time. It might just be the chronology of the vision. We see here we're going back in time. So just the fact that he's going back in time, even that understanding, doesn't make some sense. We recapitulate old material in a new way. Chapter 17 and 18 makes sense to me that it could be a critique of religious idolatry and adultery right throughout history, as represented even by the first century Jews as they rejected the Messiah, turned on the church with Roman tacit approval, saw that with the death of Jesus, at least until the Romans turned on them in AD 70. And it becomes like an image, what might be repeating, and we've seen that over and over, which we'll talk about as we go ahead. Certainly this position in my mind fits well with verse 16 of chapter 17, that the beast turns on the harlot, which to me is the issue of how can you do that if they're both the same in a sense. So you might think that's just an academic exercise, but actually it can impact how you understand this as a play, even in our time today when we see it like that. Plus, there's that sense of consistency within the text, and then our views are consistent with the text as well. So let me read chapter 18, then we'll stop for some morning tea and we'll come back. But first, any questions on chapter 17? That's a little bit academic, I know, because I've read a 40-page academic article to try and prepare it.
They talked about the mountains.
Yes. No, it has hills, not mountains. That's true. And that's one of the ways, and I'll tap on this when I talk about when we talk about the economic nature of Rome and also what that verse in chapter 17 could be. In fact, I'll say it now in case I forget it. The 7 hills upon which the harlot sits in verse 9 of chapter 17. You could read it 2 ways. If it's not Rome, what else could it be? One could be this image of a mountain is an image of authority. Again, a symbol, not talking about actual physical thing. It's a symbol, like the seven heads and the 7 kings. It isn't actually talking about the beast. It's not saying there are 7 kings. It's the, and you'll see it in chapter 19 as well. It's the power of the systems that are at play. And it might well be that the 7 mountains are talking about the authority of Rome at that time, or the authority of Jerusalem. So that's one way of dealing with that issue. And there was another one through my head and I've just forgotten, which isn't very helpful. But yeah, so there is an openness to say the 7 hills doesn't have to relate to Rome. Oh, the other one is this. So the 7 hills doesn't have to relate physically to Rome in chapter 17, verse 9. It may be talking about the authority upon which the harlot sits, which is the authority of the political state, right? Which would be Rome in the 1st century. We're just saying the issue that the symbol's trying to show is not the physical capital of Rome, but Rome's power and authority, right? The other thing when you read chapter 9, I did this during the week, it could just be describing the vision. It says, these are the 7 hills upon which the harlot sits. So John might be just saying, I saw her sitting on some hills. You know, he's not saying it is Rome. So again, it depends what you say it's referring to. And this is a really interesting point because when you get into the academics of this, I've made this point before, that many of the writers talk about what are the sources behind the vision. And we see this Old Testament echoes, and maybe he had Old Testament thoughts in mind, so he wrote it this way. I think that's going too far. I think the vision, he's writing what he's seen. He's writing a vision down. So the question is not whether John has sources, if you want to use the idea of sources. It's the Holy Spirit having sources, bringing the vision in such a way that John goes, or we go, So John might just be not trying to reflect an Old Testament echo in his own mind. The Spirit's doing that and bringing the vision, and he might just be writing down what he's seen. I think that's also potentially at play here too. And that also comes down to the chronology of it. And then I saw this next, and then I saw this next. It's not so much trying to bring a chronology in time, although there's certainly parts of that. But it might just be talking about the chronology of his vision. We'll touch on that in 19 to 20 later. Any other comments or questions?
So the idea that it might be Jerusalem, the main problem with that is the timing. Because as you said, it happened in 780, but so we are, the John here is probably looking back in time.
If you take Jerusalem in mind, and if you take a later date, which I certainly do, I think it's written in the 90s, he would have to be looking at something, and again, not him thinking, but the vision is showing him something that has already happened, right? Because he's getting it in the 90s. The other idea is it's actually written in the 60s, and there's some background to make. Well, it's not an uncommon position that some hold. In fact, this guy Ewing does argue for it and puts out a whole chapter on arguing for it. So it's not a bad thing to get if you want to find the background of that position. And if it is the 60s, it is prophetic as well about what's going to happen in AD 70. And that would fit this idea that Revelation talks about what's happening in the future. As we've said, in chapter 1, 3 times it says, I want to show you what is yet to come, or what is about to occur. My comment to that is I don't think that's a death knell to the later date, because Revelation does go back in time sometimes. What's the word? Recapitulates, or whatever the word was. I've forgotten it now. It repeats things. And like I said, even 17 is talking about something before 16 happened. Now, that's in the nature of the future, but this whole idea of going back is also part of Revelation. So part of me doesn't feel holding Jerusalem from the time perspective stops that later date. The other things that goes against it is things like the economic description in chapter 18, other things that I've outlined just briefly. But for me, that chapter 16, that the beast turns on the harlot, is a really key thing. And and you'll see it as we apply it later. We'll see it as we apply it to our time later, which we'll do at the end of the session. How that concept, where it turns on itself, is important. And the commentators who say that, Carson argues it's Rome, Sam Storms argues it's Rome, others, they talk about how the political thing can turn on the religious. And there's a point in that. But I don't think verse 16 can only be used that way. I think there's got to be consistency in the text. As I've been saying, you've got to submit yourself to the text. There's lots of boundaries of what that means, and not everyone's going to agree with me, and some will have other ones, and that's okay. We know that the big idea of this is the lamb wins in the end. Okay, end of lecture, we can go home now. But what we're doing is trying to get simplicity on the other side of complexity, honouring the text, really going into it, seeing what the scriptures say, letting the Spirit speak to us, and letting us be able to rest in that simple statement we just made, even in the midst of things of the scripture that can be quite varied. I think that's what the Bible calls us to do. Certainly, I've been encouraged by that, doing all this work. My own faith that the Lamb's going to win in the end, and I'm going to be okay, is strengthened all the more by doing this. It's not just So, hence, Revelation's a blessing. Any other comments or questions before we have some morning tea? All right, let's have some morning tea, and then we'll come back. All right, so we've looked at chapter 17. I'm going to try and finish this tea before it gets cold. And I want to go to chapter 18 now. As I finished early. I had a whole lot of other stuff there. No, I'm going to keep going. Sorry, I finished early. I should have kept going. Yeah. The angel from chapter 7, from verse 7 of chapter 18, then explains the beast and the harlot. Pardon me. We see these 7 heads and 10 horns, and this comment that I think Adele mentioned, once was, now is not, and yet will come. We talked about these, and we talked about chapter 13. It is clearly the same beast as chapter 13. The 7 hills, we've just talked about that. As I said, could be not just a reference to Rome, but could be on which she sits, could be what he is seeing in the vision, not necessarily attributing to Rome. But it wouldn't be very comfortable, would it? Anyway, I want to make this interesting side note, though, because this does come through particularly from the dispensational stuff about the 7 and the 10 hills. In the 1970s and 80s, there was a deep interest, particularly if people who read the Bible in a Revelation, a futurist way, of this image as the European common market was about to accept its 10th member. So in 1950, there were 6 original nations. There's If you don't know, the flag of the European community is the stars on a blue background. And this is a current group, we'll talk about them in a minute, who still see this today, even though it's changed. But back in 1950, when it started, there were 6 members of the European Common Market, which was France, Belgium, Germany, Luxembourg, the Netherlands. And then it increased in 1973 to 9 when the United Kingdom and Denmark joined. Don't ask me how 6 comes to 9 with 2 additions. I suspect it was 2 parts. I'm not quite sure. Anyway, but then in the late 70s, Greece was talking about joining, which would have made it the 10th. And they did join in 1981. And particularly in the 70s, a lot of comment about this is the beast. The European Common Market, or the European Community is the beast. They're going to have 10 nations centred on Rome, the Roman Catholic Church, all that stuff. I remember hearing speakers speaking about it a lot in the late 70s and the early 80s. Then that nervousness or excitement was short-lived because in 1986, Spain and Portugal joined. That made it 12. Then in 1995, Austria, Finland and Sweden joined. Then 10 more countries joined in 2004, Cyprus, Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Malta, Poland, Slovakia and Slovenia. Then in 2007, Romania and Bulgaria joined. So the EU actually has 27 members for a time until the UK decided to leave. That made it 26. But then again, Scotland stayed, and so it's all a bit of a mess. But a 10-nation godless empire based around Rome was very, very compelling as an example of what this would be. But as I said, that's not what the 10 horns and the 7 the 7 heads and the 10 horns is trying to represent. It's not trying to say this is the actual one. It's representing that authority, that powerful nature of the beast. That would actually control things of economy and these sort of stuff that we said in chapter 13. This Roman Catholic European thinking about the Harlot of the beast continues. As I said, there's Tomorrow's World. They have an article up describing who the beast, who the harlot is in Revelation 17. Although it's over 20 years old, it's still there on their website. And they talk about the harlot being the Roman Catholic Church and that Europe is where this is going to be. Pardon me, and even talks about the 10 kings and when there is a coming together of the political and the religious. So he talked about Justinian, who tried to revive the Roman Empire before it separated into 2, who was a Roman emperor, maybe the last strongest one they had before they divided. Remember, it went to the Western Roman Empire based on Rome and the Eastern Roman Empire based on what is now Istanbul or Constantinople. Justinian tried to bring them together. And brought the bishops who were in charge of the church on board to try and make that happen. And this person says that's the first king. And then he lists 6 examples of that throughout history, from Charlemagne to Otto the Great to someone else, and says there's one yet to come that points to this. As I've said throughout, these can be useful things to titillate our mind, think about, but I don't think that's the heart of what this is talking about in terms of identifying what they are. But certainly there is a point in here, we'll pick it up later, of this link between the political state and the religious state, which I think is in chapter 17, which these people are reflecting in what they're saying. Then in chapter 15 to 18, he turns to the harlot itself. The waters on which she sits are the peoples, the multitudes and the nations. And I've referred to verse 16, where they would hate the prostitute, they'll bring her down and leave her naked. They obviously refers to the triumvirate, the beast, and most of the devil and the false prophet, because the beast certainly is the heart of it here, but the others are most certainly around. And that's where I go to this point that Jerusalem may be the best way of understanding the harlot, because if it's Rome, how does the political Roman state turn upon the political religious Roman cult? And it never does that, it seems. They have to be somewhat separate. In fact, as I said, I think the reference to Jerusalem is a springboard for a warning in the vision for the rest of history that we've seen throughout the book. We've seen that as we've looked at other visions as well, or parts of the vision as well. When the institutional church and the state come close together, the church, what I mean by that is the people of faith, always seem to suffer. We see that throughout medieval and Renaissance history with the religious wars of the 16th and to the 18th century. When Protestantism grew and there was a massive religion became, to the point that people say religion is the main reason for war in the history of the world. I'm not quite sure I'd say that, but there's plenty of examples of religious wars in the history of the world. But another even more closer to home is the Catholic Church, quite affirming of Nazism in the 1930s and 40s. There's a really interesting documentary I watched on Netflix about the Pope at the time, the 2 popes in the run-up and during World War II, and how quiet they were to critique Hitlerism. and Nazism in Germany. And there could be a little element of that here as well. We do know that the people of faith in Germany were the ones that were persecuted by the Nazis. Bonhoeffer is the most obvious one, but he wasn't the only pastor who lost his life. So yes, there were 6 million Jews who lost their life, but there were many believing Christians as well. I think too, even, of how the communist government did not necessarily close the church in 1949 in China. After the communists came to power in 1949, the Christian leader Wu Yao-tsung and the premier Chow En-lao prepared what was called the Christian Manifesto, which called Chinese Christians to heighten, and you might want to comment on this, Harlot, I don't know, but certainly they published this Christian Manifesto that said, I read this Chinese Christians should act with vigilance against imperialism to make known the clear political stand of Christians in New China, that's Communist China, to hasten the building of a Chinese church whose affairs are managed by Chinese themselves. So what they want to do is the imperial nations had not been very good to the Chinese in their view, and the church was a great way. All the Christian missionaries got rid of them all. We want no non-Chinese influence here. So all non-Chinese influence is out of the church. So the Catholics weren't allowed to go back to the Vatican, and the Protestants were cut off. But they did still have a church. You know what it's called? The three self-government, self-propagation, self-support, patriotic movement. That's what the official church in China is called. That's the church that has the imprimatur of the communist government. That's the only church that can have church properties. If you're not registered with the government, you can't own a property. And even from the early 1980s, this, along with the China Christian Council, serves as the overseer of Protestant churches in China. The Catholic churches operate under the Catholic Patriotic Association. Why patriotic? Because this was the whole point. It wasn't about religion. It was about the patriotism of China. We want to control our own point. Now, I read some people this week that have been to a TPSM or whatever it is, TSPM, sorry, churches and heard quite good theology out of it. You can have some quite good individuals. The three self-propagation patriotic movement. That's the name of the official church. Because it's driven by not theology, but patriotism. And so there can be some Christians in it. The same way you can have Christians in other bad places, if you can use that phrase. But what's really interesting, I think, is the reason why non-registered churches don't register with it is because it's actually run by an atheistic government. It's accountable to a government that is based on atheism. And this is part of the point we're talking about here. And so real Christians have been persecuted in China over the years. So that's another sort of example that we're talking here. But you see at the end of chapter 17, this final verse, God has put it into their hearts to accomplish his purpose by agreeing to hand over to the beast their authority until God's words are fulfilled. Now, we're talking about the kings of the earth handing over their authority to the beast. But what's really interesting here is God has permitted that to happen, so God's ways would be fulfilled. Don't believe it's like most other pagan religions, that at the heart of creation, let alone the world itself, is the battle between good and evil. As if good and evil are on par, and sometimes evil wins and sometimes good wins. That's not the point. The point is God created evil. Yes, he did permit evil, as we can see here, but in his sovereignty, even through difficult times, whether it's to the church or even through judgment on the rest of the earth. But I've no doubt he doesn't want to see people judged. That's why he sent the Lord Jesus. He permits it to bring about his purposes. Kind of nice way to finish chapter 17, really. Yes, exactly. Exactly. I wouldn't say God's sovereignty is just merely a foreknowledge. That's what some people deal with, the whole predestination, human responsibility to say, oh, predestination is just a knowing what's going to happen. No, God is more sovereign than that. God is involved, but God is not a God of evil. And that's where our minds can't work it out. So you're quite right. He actually put it in their hearts. Why? So that his ways could be fulfilled. So it's quite a challenge to us when we can't get our head around those two things. It's like in Philippians chapter 2, 12 and 13, where it says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Do all that hard work because God is at work in you to bring out his purpose. Both there. And we can see that here as well. That's a great way to finish chapter 17 in all that God is having his way even through this godless harlot and the people of the world that are taken by her, which is where, in one sense, chapter 18 goes. Yes. Sorry, what are you saying? Yeah, that is the Great Babylon, or that is the harlot. Okay. Again, the city ruling over the kings of the earth is not so much a particular city, although you can pick references to it. When you go through history, it's not just a particular city, it's this ongoing, pervading, idolatrous, religious set that in every generation there is something. Like I said, could it be the Mormons? Yep, quite possibly. Could it be the GWs? Yep, quite possibly. Certainly, when you bring the political state and the religious institution together, you have a very, very dangerous thing. And I think that's what we see here, and we'll talk about that later. Chapter 18. Let's read this. It's a bit longer. After this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven. He had great authority, and the earth was illuminated by his splendour. With a mighty voice he shouted, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She's become a dwelling for demons and a haunt of every impure spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable animal. For all the nations had drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries. The kings of the earth committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries." Then I heard another voice from heaven say, "Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues. For her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes. Give back to her as she has given. Pay her back double for what she has done. Pour her a double portion from her own cup. Give her as much torment and grief as the glory and luxury she gave herself. In her heart she boasts, I sit enthroned as queen. I am not a widow, I will never mourn. Therefore in one day her plagues will overtake her, death, mourning, and famine. She will be consumed by fire, for mighty is the Lord God who judges her. When the kings of the earth who committed adultery with her and shared her luxury see the smoke of her burning, they will weep and mourn over her. Terrified at her torment, they will stand far off and cry, "Woe, woe to you, great city, you mighty city of Babylon. In 1 hour your doom has come." The merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her because no one buys their cargoes anymore. Cargoes of gold, silver, precious stones and pearls, fine linen, purple, silk and scarlet cloth, every sort of citron wood and the articles of every kind made of ivory, costly wood, bronze, iron and marble. Cargoes of cinnamon and spice, of incense, myrrh and frankincense, of wine and olive oil, of fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and carriages, and human beings sold as slaves. They will say, "The fruit you long for is gone from you. All your luxury and splendour have vanished, never to be recovered. The merchants who sold these things and gained their wealth from her will stand far off, terrified at her torment. They will weep and mourn and cry out, 'Woe! Woe to you, great city, dressed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, the glittering with gold, precious stones and pearls. In 1 hour, such great wealth has been brought to ruin. Every sea captain and all who travel by ship, sailors and all who earn their living from the sea will stand far off. And when they see the smoke of it burning, they will exclaim, was there ever a city like this great city? They will throw dust on their heads and with weeping and mourning cry out, woe, woe to you, great city, where all who had ships on the sea became rich through her wealth. In 1 hour she's been brought to ruin. Rejoice over her, you heavens. Rejoice, you people of God. Rejoice, apostles and prophets, for God has judged her with the judgment she imposed on you." Then a mighty angel picked up a boulder the size of a large millstone and threw it into the sea and said, "With such violence, the great city of Babylon will be thrown down, never to be found again. The music of harpists and musicians, pipers and trumpets will never be heard in you again. No worker of any trade will ever be found in you again. The sound of a millstone will never be heard in you again. The light of a lamp will never shine in you again. The voice of bridegroom and bride will never be heard in you again. Your merchants were the world's most important people. By your magic spell, all the nations were led astray. In her was found the blood of prophets and of God's people, for all who have been slaughtered, of all that have been slaughtered on the earth." Quite a compelling chapter, really. In verse 1 to 3, the angel announces the collapse of Babylon. Whereas chapter 17 sort of set the setting for it, now we actually read about it in a bit more detail. We'll send some images about that in a minute. The description here actually mirrors some of the prophecy Jeremiah wrote in chapter 50 and 51 about the fall of the Old Testament Babylon. In previous sessions, I've just said that. So I thought what I might do is actually read to you from Jeremiah and leave that up on the screen so you can see the links between the two. So Jeremiah 50, verse 2 to 3 says, "Announce and proclaim among the nations," there it is, Lift up a banner and proclaim it. Keep nothing back, but say Babylon will be captured. Babel will be put to shame. Marduk filled with terror. Her images will be put to shame. Her idols filled with terror. A nation from the north will attack her and lay waste her land. No one will live in it. Both people and animals will flee away. A lot of images there. There'll be nothing left. Goes on. Got to go back a page to find the reference to verse 12 and 13, where he writes, "Your mother will be greatly ashamed. She who gave birth will be disgraced. She will be the least of the nations, a wilderness, a dry land, a desert." This is images of what Revelation 18 says. "Because of the Lord's anger, she will not be inhabited, but will be completely desolate. All who pass Babylon will be appalled. They will scoff because of all her wounds." And then in verse 39 and 40, he writes this, "So desert creatures and hyenas will live there. There the owl will dwell. It will never again be inhabited or lived in from generation to generation." Remember in this passage it talks about unclean birds and animals will go there. "As I overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah along with their neighbouring towns, declares the Lord, so no one will live there, no people will dwell in it." So that's what he said about Babylon in Jeremiah 50. That's a similar thing we read here. The Babylon in Revelation 17 to 18 is not going to be a rebuilt Babylon later on because it wasn't going to exist again. Pardon me. But the Babylon of the Old Testament was a desperate enemy of God's people, as is the Babylon of Revelation 17 and 18. The great harlot is an enemy of God's people and is in cahoots with the beast of the sea, the great enemy of God's people in the first century and throughout history, to bring persecution on them and actually to deceive the nations, which is what she does. She promotes the idolatry, as images of adultery in verse 3 indicate. "For all the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries. The kings of the earth committed adultery with her. The merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries. Her influence goes through all the world to turn them against God." This comment, excessive luxuries, introduces us to the ones who will bring their lament later in the chapter, and shows that the people's economic security was heavily dependent upon the harlot. The reference to the kings of the earth growing rich shows that. In fact, G.K. Beale in his commentary puts it this way. He says, "Economic security would be removed from Babylon's subjects if they did not cooperate with her idolatry. Such security is too great a temptation to resist. Therefore, the verb drank refers to the willingness of society in the first century in the Roman Empire to commit itself to idolatry in order to maintain economic security. I have to worship the emperor to get food on my table." Once one imbibed, drank the intoxicating influence, it removed all desire to resist Babylon's destructive influence and blinds oneself to Babylon's own ultimate insecurity and to God as the source of real security, and numbs one against any fear of coming judgment. So as you engage with this influence of the harlot of Babylon, it numbs you against the truth that this harlot will be judged, and you trust in it and you will go down with it. And God does offer security if only you turn to him, which is the very deception that she brings, to say, no, don't trust him, trust this instead. Make your life, make your food, make your whole existence based on this. That's the best way to follow. Now, we'll go there in a minute, but I just want to say, is that not a challenge to the wealthy, rich church in the West? Let's just hold that thought and come back to it later. In verses 4 to 8, the angel brings an exhortation to people like us to avoid any complicit connection with the great harlot, a call to separate from Babylon, no doubt speaking to God's people. There it is up on the screen there. And again, Jeremiah 51, 6 to 8 says something similar. Let me read this to you. "Flee from Babylon. Run for your lives. Do not be destroyed because of her sins. It is time for the Lord's vengeance. He will repay her what she deserves. Babylon was a gold cup in the Lord's hand. She made the whole earth drunk." See the images that are so strong in what we've read. "The nations drank her wine. Therefore they have now gone mad. Babylon will suddenly fall and be broken. Wail over her, get balm for her pain, because she can be healed." That's a difference. Those who are caught up in the Old Testament could be healed if they turned to the Creator. But of course here, we're too close to the end. This call to avoid the harlot is to avoid her sins and to avoid the judgment coming upon her. In verse 6 it says double. It may be saying not just pay her back twice the amount she gave on these people, the persecution of the believers. It may be saying like a double mention. She very, very well will get the equivalent of her judgment. He's underlining it twice, saying it twice in a sense. That could also be what's going on here. But see, there is a link between the persecution she's brought on God's people and the judgment that will match it in bringing upon her. Important note here is the separation isn't necessarily only or even fully a physical separation. A number of people have used this passage to say, separate, have nothing to do with it. But you can't do that, really. You go back to the churches that he wrote to in the beginning of Revelation. They were all commercial centres. There were churches in the midst of these centres. No, what it was calling about is do not be part of her influence. Do not let what this commercial city is running it run you. In fact, do not let her, how would you put it, utter self-reliance become your mindset about life. In verse 7, she says, in her heart, she boasts, I sit enthroned as queen. I'm not a widow. I'll never mourn. The point here is, of course, widows had nothing in the first century. They were entirely dependent because they didn't have a husband anymore, and women were just chattels. They were just properties. And the big vision here is saying, I'm not going to be a widow. I can look after myself, thank you very much. I'm not going to mourn because I have everything I need. I'm a queen. Don't fall for such a tempting yet empty philosophy. Sam Storms, another commentator, says this, such confidence is more than delusion, it's idolatry. The warning of the church is evident. The warning to the church, is evident. Beware of trusting and economic security. The world may appear to provide a firewall against future distress, but it is merely an illusion. Recall the warning to the Laodiceans in chapter 3, verse 17. And haven't we seen that, You guys who are retired have suffered because the interest rates have been so low. It's getting up high now, so that's okay. But, the Great Recession of 2007-8 was a turnaround of the reliance on the economy. But we didn't actually learn because we just put all the banks up again and protected them. Now, I'm not saying we should have pulled them down, but there are these warnings that come, that the world's message, the only thing you've got to worry about is all these things, and God is left out. Not only is it delusion, it's actually idolatry. So when you think of the great Australian dream, what's the great Australian dream? Own your own home. Whenever I hear that, I hear this. I do own my own home, and I'm looking to pay it off, and I thank God for it. It's not about not owning the whole home. That's your dream. That's the point. Is your dream to have your own home, or is your dream just to honour Jesus and follow him whether he gets your home or not? That's a really, that's the thing we're talking about here. So, whenever we hear this coming through, like the old National Mutual ads when it existed back in the 90s, for the most important person in the world, me. That's the same thing. There you go, and I got phoned by one of these financial services groups the other week, you get these phone calls. I generally ignore it. But, I say, oh, we want to talk about how the government can help people in their 50s and got your own home. Well, I'm that. If you want to get a little booklet to find out, then we can give some advice. And I thought this time, I'll get a copy of their booklet. The booklet came to me, and I haven't read it because the very opening page says, let's think rich. I should have brought it along. It's sitting on my table at home, and I just haven't got to read it because I'm just so horrified by let's think rich. Now, I get what they're trying to say. Be wise about your money, and the Bible calls us to do that. But let's think rich is not that message. Let's be driven by wanting to get more rich, wanting to get more stuff. No, that's the harlot. And when the church gets involved in that, of course, the image then is the whole prosperity gospel stuff that some churches have pushed. That gets really, really dangerous. Anyway, and therefore you have these three laments in the rest of chapter 18, in verses 9 to 20. The laments of the kings of the earth, the laments of the merchants, and then the lament of the mariners. And they all say pretty much the same thing. What sort of lament is it? It's not a lament over the fall of Babylon. It's a lament over what it meant for them. There's 4 verses that talk about their lament there. It's a weeping at the impact of the fall on them. These self-reliance has impacted these kings and merchants and mariners to the point, I reckon I've got a phone call from one of those financial advisors right now. I'm just going to ignore that. The whole lifestyle has been dependent on the priorities and approach of the harlot, and now she's gone, and now they will lose. And more than that, they'll be judged. They haven't done what is said in the earlier verses to avoid the sins and the judgment of the harlot by not being part of her. And then we read this really interesting where it says 4 times or 3 times, her demise came in 1 hour. It was so swift, it was so quick, it took them by surprise. They never thought it'd be like that. And bang, went down. And you can see that through like the recession. It took everyone by surprise in 2007. The Great Depression in the late 1920s. The rise of the oil prices back in 1970, even right now, where the cost of living is going up. A year ago, that wasn't the case. Russia hadn't invaded Ukraine by that point, and our oil prices were quite low. I'm paying nearly twice as much for diesel now than what I was a year ago. That happened quickly. Which reminds me of the quickness of the fall of Liz Truss as the UK Prime Minister just recently. Wow, that was fast. I'm not suggesting Liz Truss is the harlot. Please don't see that. But this idea of it just happens quickly is the point here. In an hour, you're gone down. What's going on? It's the abruptness of the collapse of this whole way of thinking behind these merchants, this godless, idolatrous approach. And these economic descriptions are a bit like that. Let's say some suggest it's the economic descriptions of the 1st century. There's the importance of the Mediterranean Sea with the trading routes all around. Hence, they were mariners, they were kings of the earth, and they were merchants. They're all tied up in all those sea journeys and the land journeys, but the sea was the centre of the empire. That's where things were sent. And there's this huge long list, isn't there? Cattle, sheep, gems, flour, wheat, wood, and human souls or slaves that were also sent around. That's a whole other thing to talk about. But it might also be, like I said before, using language that is like the laments in the Old Testament. As I said, particularly Ezekiel 26 to 28 regarding the fall of Tyre. That it's not so much talking about a place, but a lament over the collapse of economy. This might mean the vision is using Old Testament language to express the fall of a city or people in familiar prophetic terms. I love what you said, Lynn. I just wish God would have said this more easily. Well, actually, Lynn, back then it would have been a bit more easy because they were used to it. We're just not so used to it now. And if this is what this language is saying, it does underline the point of Jerusalem and its collapse being maybe the beginning of the expression of this harlot when religion and politics join together. And when you come in verses 21 to 24 and her fall, it becomes graphic and complete. Let me read this to you. I think it's a very, very sad passage. Then a mighty angel picked up a boulder the size of a large millstone, and threw it into the sea, and said, with such violence, the great city of Babylon will be thrown down, never to be found again. The music of harpists and musicians and pipers and trumpeters will never be heard in you again. No worker of any trade will ever be found in you again. The sound of a millstone will never be heard in you again. The light of a lamp will never shine in you again. The voice of bridegroom and bride will never be heard in you again. Your merchants were the world's important people. By your magic spell, all the nations were led astray. In her was found the blood of the prophets and of God's holy people, of all who have been slaughtered on the earth. What I find really sad here is the 4 references to the collapse of joyful things in this city. You know, in verse 22, no more music, no more sense of achievement, no worker of any trade will be found. You know what a millstone is, don't you? Where they would grind wheat on the millstone. You'll see a picture in a minute. So there was no more work. There was no sense of achievement, no sense of joy. Oh, we've got something for our work today. There was no sense of music or the joy comes from that. There'll be no joy or light. There'll be no light and the joy, the bride and the bridegroom singing together, the joy of a wedding. Her deception has been found out and these things are gone. You know, the merchants were the world's most important people because their deception fed it, the economic outcome being the fruit of that. Yet their whole lifestyle and significance was based on a fallacy, based on an idolatrous, godless approach to life. The true foundation is the everlasting God and those that she has persecuted and brought down, the blood of the prophets, as it says here at the end. They will be the ones that will reign. Her persecution, one of the greatest examples of idolatry and excessive self-reliance, will bear fruit as it all comes back on her. In fact, Sam Storm's making an interesting comment at 20 to 24 this way. He says, just as the judgment, in Jeremiah 51, I won't read that. Just as the judgment of historical ancient Babylon was the cause of celebration, so too will be the judgment of eschatological Babylon. The reason for this celebration is found in a difficult statement at the close of verse 20. Although there are a number of possible translations, it most likely should be rendered either God has given judgment for you against her, or God pronounced on her the judgment she passed on you. Together with 19:1-5, this passage constitutes the consummation of God's response to the prayer of the martyred saints of chapter 6, verse 10. God has truly acted to vindicate both the honour of his name and the righteousness of those who appeal to the testimony of Jesus. It's a wonderful statement of vindication. Remember, we go back to chapter 6 where the prayers of the saints were there and God said, no, not yet, the numbers aren't full. Here, it's done. And the judgment on those who persecuted is complete. In the end, Jesus does win, and that's great. And we're going to see that next week in chapter 19 as well. In fact, I love this image of the giant millstone, so being thrown into the water, as the image this chapter talks about of the destruction of Babylon and all these godless ways. It's going to happen so quickly, and it's going to be totally crushed and goes right to the bottom of the sea. Johnson says, in one quick gesture becomes a parable of the whole judgment on Babylon the Great. Suddenly she's gone forever. You know, I think of things like the Great Recessions from a financial point of view and the godless, idolatrous approach of the world that just comes back and then it stopped and then it comes back again and then it gets challenged and then it comes back again. You know, you would have thought we'd learned something from the Great Depression back in the 1920s and 30s, but no, we did the same thing. And with the oil shocks in the 70s, and with the 1987 collapse that I knew, I was around at that point, you know, and then the 2007 one, and now it's happening again. Can't we just see that maybe there's another way of basing our lives? I think that's what Revelation's saying. And more than that, that if you do base your lives on Jesus and the Word of God, you will come out, even if you suffer in the short term, at the hands of the beast and the dragon and the harlot. And that's what I think these two chapters say to us. Why does it matter who Babylon is? What does her fall say to us today? Well, the answer to these questions underlines one important point to us, I think, to be wary. We must be very careful. And you must be very careful when political structures and religious structures come together. That, I think, is very strong in this passage. If it is, the political structure is the beast, the religious structure is the harlot, whether it's Jerusalem or whether it's other examples throughout history. When these two things come together, godless behaviour comes in remarkably godless ways. In fact, I suspect, I didn't say this on Wednesday night, but this generation that is really anti-institutional church, seems to be a greater number of that than my kids' age, is because they've seen that. And one of the greatest examples of that is the child abuse. And the institutional church protected these people who did it. So all this generation's coming out, why would I trust you? Look what happened when the power of the institutions came together. And then they see the courts supposedly supporting them. Go back in history. Remember this guy? Henry VIII became the head of the church in England because he wanted to divorce his wife. I tell my Anglican church friends that. You're only in a denomination because of a divorce, supposed, because of adultery. Talk about religious idolatry. You know, and there was horrible things that happened for many years in England, coming up to the death of King Charles, who said he had a divine right as king. There's religion and the state coming together. In the Civil War in England, the religious wars in France in particular, when the Catholics with the French royalty went down against the Protestants. Most of those in South Africa, most of those, a bit too strong a statement. There are many families in South Africa whose family trees go back to the Huguenots in France, who were the Protestants in France who escaped the persecution and went to Southern Africa. I remember going and staying in a family in Bloemfontein in 1994, and they proudly had their family tree up on the top, and it went right back to France in the 1600s. The great harlot and the beast can so easily come together against God's people, as we see in this chapter. And then they turn upon each other, which is exactly what Napoleon did. I've been talking this week about our state government's desire to pass anti-discrimination laws that provide more limitations and control on religious freedoms. A recent review of anti-discrimination laws in Queensland is suggesting that the rights of human beings should be prioritised over religious rights. You know it's feeding that, don't you? It's the whole gender issue, the whole gay issue. Could this be an investing of government power into religious behaviour, reflecting something in Revelation 17 to 18? Yeah, I suspect it is. There's a coming together, not so much of a religious institution, but they're entering into that space. This chapter does show us that the beast and the great harlot will for a time sit powerfully in the background, if not in the essence of a comfortable, well-resourced lifestyle. One of the great challenges, what's going to come, is I think Christian education will lose its government funding. Theological education will lose its government funding. And it's going to be a massive realignment of the whole business plan of Christian education. And the Christian people in education I talk to, they're trying to get ready for that, but I think they're really ready for it. They will lose millions and millions of dollars. We can't do it the same way. Some of them might say, oh, look, we really need that money, so I'm just going to say yes to some of those government things so we can get the money to help to educate people Christianly. Well, you can now see the link between religion and the state and economics, which is exactly what chapter 17 to 18 show. Related to this, I think, is the quiet challenge of, and I hear people here, particularly if I can say this, Christians on the right side of politics, that want to make Australia a Christian nation. You know, we've lost our Christian Judeo roots. We're going to argue to make ourselves a Christian nation. I think Revelation 17 to 18 argues against that point. In fact, I read something this week in the States about Christian nationalism, another way of referring this. At Politico.com, they wrote, Christian nationalism, a belief that the United States was founded as a white Christian nation and that there is no separation between church and state, is gaining steam on the right. Prominent Republican politicians have made the themes critical to their messages and to voters in the run-up to the 2022 midterm elections. Doug Mastriano, the Republican nominee for governor in Pennsylvania, has argued that America is a Christian nation and the separation of church and state is a myth. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Georgia hardliner, has declared we need to be the party of nationalism, and I'm a Christian, and I say it proudly, we should be Christian nationalists. Amid a backlash, she doubled down and announced she would not start selling, I should say, Christian nationalist T-shirts. Now Florida Governor Ron DeSantis seems to be flirting with Christian nationalism rhetoric as well. It might seem countercultural to us that we shouldn't make the nation Christian, but I think that's actually part of what the challenge of 17 to 18 is saying. It speaks against this development. Here's some nice, let's put the cross in the whole of government. Let's make Christian the centre of government. Now, certainly, if a government does not lead Christianly, the town or the city or the nation is worse off. We pray, as Romans 14 and 13 and 1 Timothy 2 calls us for our leaders, that they would lead with justice and with godliness. But to somehow legislate Christian morals through making it part of the state, that's a very dangerous place to go. And we've seen that in this chapter, and we've seen it throughout history. Promoting it may reflect a coming together with the great harlot, not avoiding her influence as we've read. Yes, we have to be present. There needs to be Christian faith in the public discourse, absolutely. But Jesus never controlled the public discourse. He was just one of the voices in it. In fact, he was a minority voice in some respects, and maybe that's what ours should be. So as we lose our Judeo-Christian roots, which I don't like, even from a legal perspective I don't like from my background, from a biblical perspective, I just stand back and say that may be something God is doing to call us as his people to be more like Jesus as we engage with our world. The Bible is full of warnings against Christian nations, and I think history is full of it too. Even in the States, when some Christian, wherever that means in the broad spectrum of Christian, cities were formed, towns were formed, and those who were leaders, like me, in those places, controlled their behaviour horribly, let alone go into much more extensive Christians like Mormonism and JWs and some of the things of that nature. So I think there is a warning here against bringing together of the religious and the political states that then ends up controlling things of the economy. It doesn't say we don't bring Christian faith into the public space, but at the very least we don't join with the other powerful things to make sure our voice is more strong. So what do we do in response? As I said, we shouldn't roll over and just take it. We should argue against overreach of governments into religious behaviour. We should make sure we have a voice. But Revelation would tell us, if I can take us back to the end of chapter 12, that the heart of our response is the people of God overcome the dragon, the beast, the false prophet, and by implication the great harlot, by their testimony to Jesus, by the ground of the blood of the Lamb, and by not loving their life to avoid death. That's the heart of our response. That's what the church should be doing ahead of anything else. Pointing us to Jesus, that we live like that. So what's coming ahead for us the next 5 or 10, 15, 20, even 50 years? If reading the signs, we see these things happening, and I think there is something of that. Our response should be this winsome, Christ-centred, rested, gospel-informed life and words of people that say you can do what you like. I know who I love and I'm going to live by, and I'm going to go through anything with him because he will take me to the end, and in the end I'm going to win with him. Chapter 17 to 18, which on the one hand seems to be another whole parallel story in this vision, really takes us back to the same place. God will win, and the strength and the overcoming comes as we rest in that, even as we may seek to engage, defend, or point out the shortcomings of the godless society around us. And I'll make one more point before any comments or questions, which is this, and I'm going to be talking more about the dispensational view of eschatology particularly. But, as one man said here, I don't mind that Left Behind series because it means I can escape all that. I'm going to go away before all that tribulation happens. My quiet reminder to us is if your way of dealing with what we're reading here is to say, oh, thank you, Lord, I'm going to be taken away, that's not consistent with those 3 points of chapter 12. It's not about escaping. It's about loving Jesus, that I don't love my life ahead of death, that I'm rooted in the gospel, and that I have a testimony of Jesus to those around me, which is going to be the hope that they'll say, why, in 1 Peter 3:15, why are you so hopeful? Because I know the Lord of all, because he's died for me and risen from the dead, because his way of life is the best no matter what happens. That's the heart of our response. My comment that I'll talk about with respect to the dispensational premillennial view that holds this rapture happening and then we escape the tribulation. My comment, as I've learned over the last couple of days of reading it, that I'll bring to those who hold it will be, well, if I'm wrong and you're right, I'm going to escape it. But if I'm right and you're wrong, are you ready to live through it? And we're only ready to live through it when we take hold of those three things that Revelation told us. So I hope that's an encouraging end, even as we're talking about these things present in our own world today, and may well be more. But there is something about the bringing together of religion and the state that I think this is talking about and the way it impacts our life. Any comments or questions?
I was just thinking about the time Jesus lived, and they were, in a Roman regime. Then you had the religious situation or system, and then there was Jesus. It was almost like he just had to find a way to.
Yes.
Regardless.
Yes. And I think it's actually a great example, Maureen, isn't it? They actually mean to be like him, not taking on the principles, for example, the Jews that kept, coming up to the state, the religious entity, which was the Jews at that time, got alongside Rome. Oh, can you kill this guy off? We can't do it. We know you can. So they go to Pilate and approach, and Jesus doesn't do either of that. He just follows what the Father tells him in the midst of that confusing space. And I think that's what I'm really enjoying going through. This is reminding me, okay, I can look for the signs. I can see this happening, and it certainly is. And people have told me more about that in the last couple of months than ever before. Oh, this is happening, and I've seen this, and I've seen this. I don't want to pour cold water on that. We should be doing that. But in the end, and I think this really underlined it, is it about just seeing the signs and escaping it, or is it about these 3 points of a testimony of Jesus, a life grounded in the blood of the Lamb, and not loving my life to the point of death, which is the real challenge. Anything else?
I totally agree with your Christian nationalism view. When I read the newspaper, especially in the United States, you can see, especially the Republicans, they're veering towards that direction. And, it's very dangerous. I don't think that a theocracy, just like what the sister said about the Jews living at the time, where it's a theocracy. Actually, the laws of the Jews consists of civil, ceremonial, and moral laws. So in essence, they control everyone, and even the 800 or so, contents of the Talmud, which was also implemented.
Yep.
To the Jews.
Yep.
They burden the Jews insufferably, and Jesus came.
Yep.
To reduce it to 2 laws.
Yep.
Love the Lord your God.
And love your neighbour as yourself.
So it's a relationship to God,
yep.
God, and a relationship to your
which is the foundation. If I can, yeah. Yep. We look at, if you want to use the word Christian legislation, Christian laws, it's those two laws that through which you read everything else. So you don't do it because you have to. I'm going to be punished if I don't. You do it through God's grace to say, I want to live that way. That's the way he wants me to live. And which is the sadness for me when God is left out of all these discussions. I totally get why they're not. It's a godless state and they're not going to look at God's perspective. But if they could have the humility to go, actually, if we look at what he is, because Jesus is still held very high in people's most views, then maybe I might listen to what he has to say and put that into practice. Not from a legalistic point of view, but as a series of aspiration or whatever, and call people to that. Now, the reason they neglect it is because the church has been so powerful and the church has been controlling, and we've done the very thing in some respects the harlot has been like, but perhaps you could say. So, grace has been lost in the heart of the church. I will say this. I know a church where a man who is a young man who is leading worship is doing it in bare feet. And some people in the church, they've been told, are very frustrated that this man is doing bare feet. You shouldn't lead worship with bare feet. How dishonourable is that? And that talk sort of going around the church a bit. The fact this person has bare feet is because they've got a slight medical condition from an Asperger's, very slight Asperger's thing, and tactile touching is so important. So they haven't even asked the question of why he's got bare feet. They've just jumped to this conclusion, which is like the church has done so often, And I think those little, I'm not saying we're coming one with the state there, but there's an example of the legalistic approach of the Pharisees, the coming together, that because we've done that, a whole generation now has little to do with have very low view of the institution of the church because we've controlled things a little bit like what this chapter is saying, although at more distance. Which underlines even more that if you want to witness and bring some of these people to Christ, it's not through the institution, it's through the relationships one-on-one, and they can see the witness of Jesus in your life. And they go, man, I didn't think you'd accept me. I thought you had this view. No. So it's a frustrating but good challenge to have. And I think your link with the Jews is a great one, Maureen. I hadn't seen it in that light as directly as that, and even underlines more this view that maybe Jerusalem is the expression of the harlot back then, because there was that, and eventually they did turn on each other. So, all right, I might finish in prayer. Lord, I want to thank you that you are the God of all, and that you will win in the end, and that we, your people, will stand with you on that day. We're going to talk more about that more in the next couple of chapters, I know. But in a world that is working more and more against you, and we know it's done that many times over the last 2,000 years, and even before that, we read about the Babylonians attacking the Jews and the judgment of Babylon back in the before Christ today. That through all this, you have remained constant, and your grace and your power is not only available, but when we look, it's actually evident. It's actually real. And we pray that we as a church would reflect that. We pray we as individual believers would reflect that to those around us. And we ask that even if we have disagreements, that we're going to have disagreements over things like eschatology, we know that there will be a sense even that we can disagree with a smile on our face and a love for one another. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Thanks, everyone.
When you